Randy Bradley, who's going to take us down the digital transformation world. Randy, take it away.
Thank you very much, Dave. And that was a great panel, Joel. And we're happy to join you this afternoon to talk about digital transformation in life sciences, primarily focusing on what can we do to ensure that we put forth what we refer to as an anti-fragile supply chain. And so with me today, I have several distinguished panelists who I would like to introduce. First, I'd like to introduce Ricky Ellis, who's the digital transformation lead for Genentech. And then there's Rich Kilmer, who is the CEO for CargoSense, followed by Roddy Martin, who's the Chief Digital Transformation Officer with TraceLink. And then we have Suzanne Sherman, who's the CEO of Chronicle. And then last but not least, we have Leon Travert, who is the Senior Director of Global Supply Chain Planning for Illumina. So what I'd like to do is start with asking each one of the panelists to briefly give you a little information about their background, expertise, and about their organization. And then after that, we'll jump into a series of questions. So let's go ahead and start with Ricky. If you will tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Ricky Ellis. I'm a digital transformation lead at Roche Genentech. I'm part of our data, digital, and analytics supply chain function, where we're trying to take sort of a holistic approach to data, digital, and analytics and applying it to the supply chain. In terms of background, I've been in this role for about 2 years, spent a lot of time the last 10 years in similar roles, albeit in different industries from financial services to automotive and things like that. So really excited to be a part of this panel and talk to everyone today.
Thank you, Ricky. Rich, you will be next if you would.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for the opportunity to talk today. My name is Rich Kilmer. I'm the CEO of CargoSense, and CargoSense is a logistics intelligence platform. We're independent of different types of hardware devices that are out there that might be able to illuminate what is happening in your supply chain. But what we're trying to do is bring that information together in a central platform so that we can better control the distribution process of these products, better control exactly what's happening to these products as they're moving through those distribution networks on a per shipment basis. And so we're trying to do that in real time, all the time, but also in a way in which scales actually, and both from a monetary perspective, but also from a technology perspective, and really gives us the ability to control what's happening in these warehouses where we have less and less manpower to be able to control the distribution of these products.
Thank you, Rich. It's good to have you with us today. And next we'll have Roddy Martin.
Thank you very much. So I'm Roddy Martin. I started off leading supply chain for what in those days was South African breweries, came to the United States and started the supply chain practice at AMR Research, which obviously eventually became Gartner. And then when Gartner acquired AMR, I left and went as a partner to Accenture, worked for a company called CCI doing supply chain performance improvement across industries, worked for Oracle, and I'm now with TraceLink, where Chabert asked me to join him to transform what effectively TraceLink's expertise in serialization and track and trace to use the platform that TraceLink has built up as an end-to-end multi-commerce platform, and we've made great progress, and it's a great challenge. So thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Thank you, Rod. It's a pleasure to have you with us today. Next up will be Suzanne.
Hi, everyone. I'm Suzanne Sherman. I'm CEO at Chronicle, where we are bringing the industry together to define industry-level protocols and enabling this on a software platform that is powered by blockchain. So it truly allows decentralized execution of business processes across companies, automating business in the space in between. Our focus has been track and trace solutions in support of compliance with the Drug Supply Chain Security Act. And we're also working on revenue management solutions as well. And my background actually is 25 plus years of supply chain in the pharmaceutical industry. So really looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Suzanne. It's great to have you with us today. And last but not least, we will go to Leon.
Hey everyone, thanks for the opportunity to be on this panel. Yeah, I'm Leon Travert. I lead global supply chain planning in Illumina. Illumina is a company that does next generation DNA sequencing. So in my role, I'm responsible for everything global supply chain planning, but also lead our digital breakthrough objective. So how do we have digital strategies in each element of the supply chain and join them together? A bit of history. Before coming to Illumina, I was in Medtronic. I was in the med device space. Prior to that, I was in the UK, so I've got a funny accent, in the biopharmaceutical space. So a lot of different experiences within life sciences as a whole, but ultimately landed in sunny California with the opportunity to drive this digital vision forward for Illumina.
Thank you, Leon. And the beauty of this panel is we kind of have the smorgasbord, if you will, of experiences where we have biotech organizations represented, we have solution providers represented. So I think it should make for a relatively rich conversation. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to throw the first question out. And I'm going to start with you, Roddy, because I know this is one of the areas that you're passionate about. And so when you think about, when we talk about how fragile the supply chain has been, whether we're talking about life sciences in aggregate, or even if we get down to something that's a bit more specific to what you do with respect to TraceLink, what do you see as some of the blind spots across industries that pertain to trying to achieve supply chain agility?
You know, the one word that's unfortunately horribly overused today is this issue of visibility. You know, the reality is that the business leadership team, the operating model, can't see upstream beyond one or two partners, and it can't see downstream towards the patient's one or two partners. So it's very difficult for the company to dynamically align the business. So I would say the one big blind spot is the lack of a blueprint, a roadmap for the business to dynamically adjust the business based on what's happening on the demand side and what's happening on the supply side. And I mean, that's exactly what we've seen happen in the pandemic. And Randy, you and I were on, in a big conference for the last 3 days, and that's all we heard was visibility, the lack of alignment, the lack of a blueprint. So I think actionable visibility and accurate data is a blind spot. And I'll make one last point that, unfortunately, especially in life sciences, companies have relied on ERP systems, and they were good at the time, but they're just not enough for the future because they can communicate point to point with each other. But the problem is the data is shared, data is duplicated. And so to build a multi-commerce healthcare environment with multiple companies all having ERP systems, to try and synchronize that network is virtually impossible.
So Ricky, let me go to you, because you have some experience with respect to building these roadmaps and helping organizations not only define them, but being able to execute them as well. So what are your take on what you're hearing from Roddy and also what you've seen?
Yeah, actually, Roddy used the exact words I wanted to use. So I think we overlap there. And maybe instead of visibility, I'd say it in terms of connectivity, at least what we're recognizing within Roche Genentech. And what I mean by that is internally, one of the steps we've taken as I introduced myself, I started at Genentech as a digital transformation lead within a supply chain digital organization, which was separate from analytics, which was separate from data. But even in recognition of internal connectivity, we've tried to lump them together. And we've added another element to it, and we now call ourselves analytics digital data supply. And supply is so that we're using that connectivity for the other word Roddy used, which is sort of actionable. And what I mean by that is it's one thing to stand up capabilities, and it's another thing to build cool solutions on top of those capabilities in silos. But it's the third thing to use that connectivity and that everything that we have to create actionable insights upstream, downstream, within our four walls, but then also outside to the broader ecosystem. So for me, to answer the question more directly, and for us, it's been more about how we think about connectivity and how we organize around connectivity, and establishing roadmaps that address all the disparate pieces together, as opposed to trying to solve problems or put cool solutions in place one at a time.
So Rich, your company, one of the things you're trying to do is address this connectivity issue or this connectivity concern. So I'll let you speak to this.
Yeah, so it's interesting because we think of connectivity between systems, right? Systems we might have, systems our suppliers have, systems maybe our customers have, or our distributors. And the problem is most of those are legacy systems, right? So how do we move data between these legacy systems that are very hard to integrate with? I mean, our approach is you can't argue with the physical goods that are literally sitting in your warehouse if you actually knew they were sitting in your warehouse. The ERP systems, as Roddy said, may not actually know that that product's in your warehouse because somebody didn't log it right. And so our whole thing is that the real world tells us what's real, right? And if we could measure that, if we can have that data feed up into a new layer of visibility, one that's actually based on things moving from suppliers to our manufacturing, from manufacturing downstream, all the way down to, once it goes from McKesson out to a hospital network, does that pharmaceutical know that that particular box of that product actually is the one that went to that hospital? No, they don't have that visibility all the way downstream. And so the ability of having a technology layer, a new layer that we can build on top of the real world, the physical movement of these things, and then bring that up into these existing ERP systems, I think is the basis for that visibility and for that for the ability to accurately plan.
Perfect. So Suzanne, as our self-proclaimed supply chain geek, you heard it. You've heard data integrity. You heard visibility. You've heard provenance. This is right in your wheelhouse.
Yep. I think another layer to add to this conversation is I think the technology exists, right? There's a lot of real world reasons why we don't do it. But one of the other big layers we found, and especially in the life science industry, this data is really valuable. People don't want to share it with each other. And so certainly what we're working on is a construct that can allow the free communication and trusted exchange of that data. We can put rule enforcement so that the data is validated and it helps clean it up. But how do you incentivize a hospital to share the information of where the inventory is at? How do you incentivize a wholesaler to share that information? A lot of people make individual business arrangements in their contracts to have access to that data. But for us, I think that's the more interesting picture. There's tremendous value for everyone. And how can we carve out how everyone wins when this data starts being shared? And I think that's really the interesting challenge that obviously this pandemic has highlighted. And how can we come together? All day, speakers were talking about collaboration. I think everyone in principle wants to, until they look at their own toys and realize they don't want to share. And so how do we get past that? How do we figure out the models? And maybe it's brand new business models that enable that sharing to really tap into this value for everyone.
Suzanne, you nailed it when you talked about these brand new business models, right? Because oftentimes we confuse digitalization with digital transformation. And the transformation is where we really start to bring about these new business models. And we'll come to that in just a minute. But I want to quickly go to Leon, because Leon, in your role with respect to supply chain planning and also having led digital strategies for some time, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I think you just kept connecting with what Ricky said, really, that the collaboration and connectivity and having a unified layer and getting that insight is really where the value is. So we have a mantra of detect, analyze, and act, and trying to build that construct that looks at the end-to-end supply chain with the ability to then step out customer and end tier suppliers to really tease out what are the key points in there that we need to go look at. And we are building out a unified planning area and a unified application platform to be able to get that. So just echoing really what Roddy and Ricky said and being enabled by the others, that's definitely the way to unlock the value. The only thing I will call out, and we did touch on it, was, and this was kind of my answer to this question in terms of the first challenges, is that differentiation between digital and digitization. Digitization is an operational necessity. We need to be more efficient, but what's the real value driver that you get out of these digital, in parentheses, opportunities? That's difficult to gauge and to quantify, because there's so much opportunity with the advent of technology. that it's difficult to quantify. But we know, to Susan's point, the technology is kind of there. It's just how do you go approach taking advantage of it? That bit's a bit fuzzy.
Yeah, so Randy, if I can just chime in. Randy and I heard a lot of examples where companies were talking about one of the things that they see a lot of, and that is companies taking existing manual operating models and trying to digitize them, and that's a fundamental mistake.
Yeah.
I mean, it's about pivoting the business to patient-centric and coming up with the digital model that's going to, completely reshape the business.
So Roddy, to that point, and also what Leon was saying, I think one of the reasons that we're seeing that is because people are trying to save face. And I think this comment came up from one of the attendees, which was, we talk about these enterprise systems and they tend to be really more of a push-oriented approach with respect to the supply chain. And the question is, when and will we get to a pull-based mechanism when there's so much invested in these? And I think to your point, Roddy, the reason organizations are trying to do the same things new ways is because it's hard to admit that we've invested in archaic infrastructure that solved one problem, but we thought it would solve the world. So how are the organizations that you're in now, or organizations you previously worked with, addressing this challenge?
Well, I'm watching Suzanne out of the corner of my eye because it's exactly what Suzanne said, right? I mean, if you're going to pivot to outside in patient-centric, you better understand what's driving patient behavior. And you and I both had John Gatorna on our panel, who's done some incredible work in Australia on segmenting outside in demand-driven behaviors so that you're not looking at individual patients. With the fines that we've seen over the last 15 years in the industry, where billions of dollars of fines because pharmaceutical companies used patient data and let it out into the industry. That's not what I don't think Suzanne was talking about. But you can build models about that demand and use that demand to put the right inventory at the right place. Use that demand to drive supply, make the supply in the right geographic areas, and then there's a good chance that you don't have to run the supply chain with a 300-day insurance policy.
Perfect, Roddy. Suzanne, you look like you were chomping at the bit to get in there.
No, I think Roddy's right. I think the other hard part, though, is a lot of our supply chains haven't been built for that type of agility. It's literally been designed for enormous batch processing that takes place across months. And so that fuels the same problem. But I know there's a lot of great work in segmentation. I do agree the signals can get much better. I just don't know if the actual supply chain infrastructure can adapt as quickly, but to be worked on.
To go back to my ERP comment, and this is the last point I'll make. I mean, one of the problems is if you have these point-to-point ERP communications that are transactional, you've got data copied all over the organization. Suddenly you've got massive lead times and lag times in the data. Now you've got to allow for that in all your planning algorithms, and you land up, building a massively complex planning architecture, solving what problem. And so when you can exchange, and I think I've heard Ricky say this before, when you can exchange and collaborate real-time data on the basis of events across the network, you don't have to deal with all the lead times and the lag times that are embedded in ERP systems.
So let's go to something that Ricky brought up. And Ricky, I'm going to toss this back out to you first, where the question came up about, are we really moving towards having different types of operating models and different business models? So when you think about, is digital transformation the vehicle or a vehicle to improve supply chain resiliency?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I'll try to keep it brief. I want to go back to something Suzanne said, which I think is in the evolution of this digital transformation, at least in Roche Genentech, one realization, at least I've come to, is that the legacy infrastructure, there's nothing to feel bad about. It's critical to business, just period. It's foundational. And I think Leon touched on this. One of the things we're trying to recognize is, as opposed to trying to change it or repurpose it to do these new business models, we're trying to compartmentalize it or leverage it to create new layers on top of it. And I say that then to get to your question, which is, I don't know that these new business models are entirely driven by digital transformation. I think they're actually driven by becoming more patient-centric that gets tied into digital and things like that. But I think the beauty of these two things coming together is we're starting to position our infrastructure to do that. And the most important thing I think Leon said is we're trying to build new layers on top of it with the specific purpose of solving these business challenges or realizing new business models that can be purpose-built. And when you do that from the start, I think some of the things that Rich has mentioned, that Suzanne's mentioned, those capabilities, building things that can share that specific element of data or purpose-built for that specific segment of customer, or look upstream and downstream, is much more attainable than trying to say, take the legacy, digitally transform it, whatever that means, and build a new business model on top. So that's been our approach, but would be curious for others' thoughts on that.
So Ricky, it sounds like what you're advocating for, which is, I think, a very practical approach, which is, and we've heard this phrase before with respect to a bimodal supply chain. You've got something that's built around operational excellence, but at the same time, you've got to start to pivot towards digital, but you can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We got to figure out how to bridge the gap. So Leon, I'll let you weigh in here, and then Rich, I'll let you follow.
Yeah, so yeah, that's been a challenge that I've actually been working through for the past 4 years. So how do you take advantage of this technology, but just not try to reinvent the wheel and do everything? And it's been a journey. I think, yeah, I don't know where to start with that. The journey that we've been having has really been around getting at that connected insight. So we've got this core ERP underneath and it's churning, and we try to make that as efficient as possible. But the value and insight that we get out comes from this other layer. And having this unified layer where we've got the right information, and we can actually align that to an end-to-end business process. And I'm talking purely within our business now, but with the potential to expand out. If I'm the business process owner for order to cash, which might not be within my specific business function of global supply chain planning, but I own order to cash, I want to be able to see that with all of this connected information underneath to make intelligent decisions around where I need to go. And that's the kind of path that we're moving forward with in Illumina, is how can I get that connected view without having to recreate everything underneath. So using that layer above it.
Thank you, Leon.
Can I piggyback on Leon's comment? Yeah. I think, and maybe I'm aiming too highly on, order to cash is such a great example. Order to cash is a process that goes outside your company, right? Like it goes to other people. And that's where we actually think the exciting transformation is going to happen. And maybe, strangely enough, as we're talking to companies who are really driving optimization in their own four walls, is it actually going to prove problematic? Like everyone has gotten so capable of optimizing based on their data. And then the moment they have to interact with a trading partner, it all starts falling apart. So maybe I'm aspirational, but I really aspire for the idea of this collaboration and how we can actually optimize across trading partners where everyone wins, right? Versus just optimizing in your own four walls.
Well, Suzanne, now what you're hitting on is, which is one of the distinctions that we try to make when we work with executives, is when you think about which business processes you want to digitalize, not just digitize them, but actually digitalize them. When you ask them, what are those processes within the walls of the organization? They can answer that to some degree. Probably about 25% of them know that. But when you ask about those processes that go beyond the organizational borders, that number quickly drops to less than 5%, which tells me they're not even thinking about that yet, but yet those are those core business processes. So Rich, I'm going to let you go ahead and jump in here.
Yeah, thank you. It's funny, the reason I like the logistics part of this, like the kind of physical part of the supply chain, right, is because it's inherently collaborative. It's so complex. There are so many different people that touch freight as it's moving from the United States to Europe, or, the independent companies that have no flow of data really through them, maybe paperwork, right? Signed documents. And even if you digitize that, the actual product itself, the pharmaceutical companies, in order to control that distribution, in order to ensure the integrity of that product on the other side, yes, they put things like temperature data loggers in there to assure that on the other side that happened. but they set up these, lane qualifications where they say, here's what we want to do on every step of the process. And then their forwarders set up, processes to match that, right? Their forwarder SOP, and the carriers have their same SOP. But who's verifying, or how are we verifying that those SOP steps are done on every single shipment? We don't, because it's very hard to be able to do that manually. It's very hard for people to do that. What we need is something that's done as the freight is moving, not, and then that brings up, that physical connectivity, that physical flow, if you will, up into this level of higher level collaboration, of higher level business rules and exchanges of information, which are operating, between companies at just a different level, right? And I mean, I really am operating at that lower layer, in the logistics layer, and not at this higher supply chain layer, and the business rules around that. But still, I think that they are the same issues, right? Just at a different level. But it is a complex problem. There's no doubt about that.
So a question that we have here from an attendee, it pertains to this digital connectivity. So I'll allow each of the panelists to interpret and define digital connectivity however you see fit. But the question is how would you rate the level of digital connectivity between pharma or vaccine manufacturers and third-party logistics providers?
Well, let me dive in where fools fear to tread, right? I mean, I think that one of the crown jewels, and actually the reason I joined TraceLink, was because TraceLink has built a canonical, and this is not about TraceLink, but this is a principle, right? When you're building a platform like Amazon Prime or Amazon Web Services, has built a canonical that says, well, once I connect with you once, I know what your connection standards are. I can connect with you the same way every time. And when I go and want to connect with somebody else on the same platform, the same network, I'm going to ask them how they connect. It's kind of like a friend request on Facebook. Once I've established that connection, I have connectivity between those two partners. So let's go to your question. Your question says, well, as long as the vaccine manufacturers can define how they're going to connect to the network, and as long as the hospitals or the suppliers or logistics partners can identify how they are going to connect to the network to provide their assets, and as long as you have those standards, this lookup table will deal with the translation of data moving from one partner in the network to the other. Without that, you have to tie systems together, and that's why it's been an abomination of a failure up until now.
So Roddy, it sounds like you're referring to really what we understand as B2B integration.
Exactly.
Which is something we thought we had licked. And I believe that to some degree we have. However, where I think the challenges remain is now we're transitioning to what I refer to as a B2B or B2X integration, which is because consumers want to do business however they want, whenever they want, and in whatever way they want, which means it's not as simple as connecting to the same systems anymore. Those systems could change based on every type of connection that's going to be established.
Exactly. I always use the example of me and Prime, right? When I connect to an Amazon supplier, they don't first ask me, how are you going to send me your data? They just tell me, well, what do you want to order from me? And then they'll figure it out. They got my credit card and my address. They're going to figure out how they're going to get it to me. So I think that, what's happened is we've devolved down to the data B2B standards, to your point, and how we connect in a codified way so that whenever parties do connect in the future, you have characterized that connectivity.
Ricky, what are your thoughts on this?
No, I mean, I would just echo that sentiment. I think the current state is exactly as Roddy described, where if I'm being very honest, for new things as they come up or new modalities within our portfolio, you're often establishing new B2B connections, new manufacturers, new logistics providers for specific needs, et cetera. And that's just the reality. I think the hope, and I think Suzanne touched on this a bit, is to start to develop networks, though, which I think is what you're mentioning with B2X and what Roddy's speaking to, and sort of the platform approach that Amazon's taking, which is can we establish it with a logistics provider or whatever it may be once, and then reuse that connection for the various new types of communication we're going to need to do, or we know we're going to need to do? I think I'm saying something pretty obvious in an idealized state, but I'm also just suggesting that we're recognizing it and are open to it and are trying to push down that path with a lot of what we're doing.
Suzanne?
Yeah, I mean, I think to sort of piggyback on Roddy's comments, the way we've approached it is by using a blockchain layer. Companies can put their identities on the blockchain, and frankly, point-to-point integrations are a thing of the past. Now that you are connected to this network, you can connect and send information and communication to anyone else. The other thing we like about how we're approaching this is it enables true peer-to-peer communication. There isn't a third party who has to sit in between anymore. Companies literally can own and manage their own data. And maybe to give a clarity, Chronicled is truly building these software solutions, but actually doesn't have access. Companies run it themselves. People control their own data. We think that's also the future. So that, again, as we're looking to create these new business models of sharing data, sharing information, companies can literally do it directly with each other. So there's not a solution provider who has to sit in between. And I will also say, I agree with Roddy, connecting ERP to ERP. I think a lot of people view the underlying vision for blockchain is that's what it eventually can enable. But everyone has customized their own system. People are not necessarily operating on the same standards. So I just have to make a plug here for industry standards are still really vital for all of this data to be able to talk to each other. And if you're doing any work on standards, keep fighting the good fight.
So Suzanne, before I go to Leon and Rich, I want to ask you a follow-up question here, which is part of one that came in from an attendee, which is when you think about data quality and when those organizations who are concerned about not only the quality of their data, but the quality of any trading partner's data that would actually be put onto the chain, what would you say to them to address that concern?
Right. So two quick things. First, my story from my supply chain background prior at actually Genentech is everyone thought their master data inside the company was fantastic. And when we started running programs to actually audit that data, shame on everyone, right? Like literally people who thought they were good, maybe they had 20% compliance, right, against rules. So it actually does take some investigating and pushing that even well-intended people aren't even aware what they're doing wrong. What's cool about the way we're developing our solutions is we're actually enabling that business rule enforcement. So if your trading partner is sending you information, you can actually have it stop at their door. And literally it sends them a note to say, hey, these fields are missing, or, this information isn't, it's supposed to be numeric. You didn't put a number in that field. It sounds really basic and simple, but allowing people to honestly get that check before the data comes to you saves you the time and headache of having to fix your trading partner's data, and you know that the rules are met. So there's a lot of technology today that can actually enable that validation, but I'm going to guess everyone has work in their own house to do to clean up, but we need to have the enforcement to start seeing that to drive that.
Yeah, you touched on something I wish we had time to explore, which is what are the implications for chargebacks as it relates to this particular process, because that can be extremely a financial issue for many organizations, but we won't go there today. We'll come back another time and talk about that. Rich, Leon, anything you want to add to this?
Yeah, I'll go first. I guess I like the concept of having this network and everybody trading and getting visibility is fine. The only thing I'd call out is we do need to recognize different customer bases for the business. So if I take Illumina as an example, our customer base is quite diverse. We've got some small research labs in universities that are using our equipment, and that scales all the way to big labs like LabCorp, Quest, Foundation Medicine, which is scale. So B2B could potentially work there. But when you're talking about, the lab tech in a small university that's using our product, they haven't got an ERP system. They're planning on spreadsheets. And this is really where the digital value bit comes together. So if, for argument's sake, I have a connected machine that this guy's using, and I can tell when it's running, and I can see what their inventory is, I can suggest an order to them to say, I see you're running, it's going low. Here, this is what I think you need to order. there's value to drive there. So that connectivity is something that we would kind of poke at. But that would be completely different to the bigger labs where we would want some B2B stuff and be a bit more formal. So
Right.
it's about having that different differentiation.
Yeah, so we have to be nimble with respect to whatever solutions we put out.
Yeah, it comes back to the agility.
And what I would add to that is we have to be able to measure our partners' performance, right? I mean, these, our forwarders, if you're a shipper and you're working with your forwarders, how are you measuring their performance? How are not this they reporting back to you, but I've sat in some of these QBRs that they use, these quarterly business reviews with their forwarders, and there's very little information they have, right? They have, how many excursions did we get using you, or a certain airline that maybe they're using? There's very little information that way. How many things were on time or delayed? But we need to go far deeper than that. In order to ensure product integrity, which we all need, right? I mean, if we can get product to the end patient very quickly, but its efficacy is compromised, it doesn't matter, right? We can sit here and say, hey, we're going to give everyone these vaccines, but the vaccines are compromised because they went out of temperature range. How do we know that? How do we assure that? And if we can, in our view, if you control that process, you protect the product, right? The product is protected. But we need to be able to then measure the process. And we need to make sure that all of those SOPs that we're layering on those forwarders can produce enough information that we can judge that we can say, this area carrier is doing really well. This one's declining. Why? We increased the number of shipments, and then the number of excursions went up really high. Why? Maybe they were at their limit of being able to have things within a certain type of storage room, like that sort of things. Like, we don't know that. There's all kinds of capacities in the logistics part of this that are invisible to almost everyone. And so we need this kind of granular data to be gathered so that we can actually build up this type of information so that we can judge this performance and we can fix weaknesses in it. That gives us, I think, the basis of agility. Like, if we don't have that, we will have very fixed things that we trust, and we will only do those things because we don't trust change.
All right. So we're going to hit this one here, which I think, based on time, will likely be our last question. But essentially, so we've laid out the problems pretty well, and we're not going to address them all today, but I'm looking forward to working with all of you and your organizations to really help to advance the industry with respect to this. So when you think about where we're trying to go in life sciences, where we want to ensure that we can provide superior patient outcomes, we want to improve cost effectiveness as well as cost transparency, what are some of the necessary ingredients and the opportunities that we need in order to deploy what we consider to be effective digital transformation in life sciences?
Yeah, let me dive in. And Randy, you remember how much talk there was about people, right, at this last event. I think let's not forget that Agile is people, process, and technology. And, I'm an engineer, and I grew up building small microprocessor circuits, and you drew timing diagrams to make sure that every leg of the timing diagram got triggered at the right time. That's not how organizations work. We can't automate people out of their jobs with digital.
Right.
We've got to adapt people's work. We've got to give them new ways and new opportunities to work. And I think we've horribly underestimated the impact that all of this digitalization is going to have on the skills people need, the way we're going to organize them, and I think, quite honestly, the kind of work that we expect them to do. I mean, so I think we have to pay more attention to the people aspect of agility, because you can't automate them out of the business. Our supply chain credo that we built with massive input from the industry, it clearly says you use systems to augment people's practices and behaviors. You don't replace people with systems.
I agree with that fully, Roddy. Ricky, we'll go to you next.
Yeah, I mean, following Roddy, it's always, I feel like I'm just going to repeat, but I think fundamentally it comes down to what I mentioned at first, connectivity and finding ways to recognize the organization needs to use technology to advance its purposes, not the other way around, looking for technology and then trying to organize around it. And I think one of the things we've done and had some success with is a word we haven't mentioned yet, is sort of experimentation. And that sounds quite obvious, but we've done that beyond experimentation with new technologies like blockchain, but we've done it in the sense of operationalizing blockchain. I think it goes a bit to what Suzanne was saying, and that taking the people and the technology together and trying to run pilots that understand how we would operationalize it, what a person's role would be or should be in a system that uses that technology or a new business model enabled by that technology. And then coming up with, okay, what is this actually going to look like if we scale it? And trying to trace that back through not just technical IT implications, but operational and organizational implications. And it's one thing, we've run a number of pilots and sort of POCs as everyone does, but we had also stood up a standalone incubator for our supply chain organization to get involved in. And we found a lot of success with that organizational aspect through that avenue.
Leon?
Yeah, I'm going to go with the talent. So essentially trying to find the right talent that's got that mindset is going to be the most necessary ingredient. If you think generationally, as our supply chainers or planners of the future are coming up, there's a expectation of leveraging technology. The future supply chainers are walking around with huge amounts of power in their hand, and a huge amount of connectivity, and that's only going to get quicker. So having the talent available to be able to deliver on that is going to be one of the most necessary ingredients to conceptually think about it. It's just an expectation to be connected now with the generations that are coming up. So taking advantage of that and finding that is one of the best opportunities. The only other thing I'd throw out there, Andy, is really looking at it holistically. I think we spoke about it in the other questions. Don't think about it in the piecemeal and siloed approach, but really think about it end to end, outside of your four walls, as Suzanne said, and then come up with your digital transformation strategy, thinking about that. For me personally, my maturity that I measure from our end-to-end S&OP process, to get to the highest level of maturity, I need to step outside of Illumina. I need to talk to customers and customers and the different channel partners, and I need to talk to the supplier's supplier. We need to go outside of the four walls to really drive that collaboration and value, and that drives up my overall end-to-end business process.
You're starting to be viewed as a maverick now, Leon.
Yeah.
Rich, you're up.
Thanks. So, I'm just going to go back to this point about this being about people. We fixate on making sure that the kinds of things that we're doing work for people in a warehouse, because when you're talking about the supply chain, ultimately those people either driving a forklift or instrumenting a pallet with something, following those procedures, it has to work for them at scale. It has to be as implicit instead of explicit as possible. It needs to be humane, right? So I'll use that term. It needs to be humane technology. We can build ivory towers that are inhumane. Just look at Facebook. But what we want to do is build things that are there to augment people, to make their process better, to make them to catch them when they make mistakes. That's fine, and help them do better, right? But ultimately, this technology can be there to really support people to magnify what they can do. And I think that's what all this should be about.
Suzanne, you get the last word amongst all the panelists.
Awesome. Well, two things came to my mind. First, again, it's been echoed a lot today. I think collaboration definitely ties into the theme of people, but I really think the value proposition that's sitting not just within your own company, but across companies is going to require collaborating in a brand new way. And the other one, frankly, Leon, you inspired me with your discussion of how your machines are going to reorder for your customer. I actually want to give everyone the challenge. Technology today can do, frankly, almost anything.
Right.
And you almost have to get out of your own mind and space of how you've done business to try and imagine if nothing existed and you had magic, how would you actually want to run the way you do your your business today. I think often, and I use the smartphone as an example, we didn't know we needed our smartphones, right? And today we can't live without it because of all the things it was able to enable. I mean, my joke all the time, I can find my son in 20 seconds. I didn't know I needed that, except I did in real life. And I think there's so much in supply chain and how we can make this all work better if we actually just dreamt of what the perfect world would be and maybe step backwards from there, versus I would say what often ends up happening is we get trapped in the way we do it today and we want to fix it from there. So hopefully leaving everyone with the vision to try and get crazy and think of it from the future looking back.
So in the 80 seconds that we have left, I want to thank you guys tremendously for the time that you devoted to this panel today. Thank you for your engagement and partnership with BSMA, and we look forward to working with you in the future. And I want to close with one thing that I heard you all consistently say, which is we often hear that people need jobs, but I wonder, could it be that jobs need people? People need to be augmented, tasks need to be automated, and yet patients really need to be the impetus for what we're trying to do. So we always ask the question, why do we do what we do? And what if we thought to do it differently? Thank you guys very much. I yield my time to the distinguished gentleman from Dallas-Fort Worth. Dave, back to you.
Thank you so much, Randy. What a great session. And I know that we could go on for quite a bit more, but obviously we got to keep moving.